New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring logic, science, and the meaning of life. With me is Bernardo Kastrup, who is the author of Rationalist Spirituality, an exploration of the meaning of life and existence informed by logic and science. His other books include Meaning in Absurdity, What a Bizarre Phenomena Can Tell Us About the Nature of Reality, Dreamed Up Reality, Diving into the Mind to Uncover the Astonishing Hidden Tale of Nature, Why Materialism is Baloney, How True Skeptics Know There Is No Death and Fathom Answers to Life, the Universe, and Everything. Brief Peeks Beyond, Critical Essays on Metaphysics, Neuroscience, Free Will, Skepticism, and Culture. More Than Allegory, on Religious Myth, Truth and Belief, and The Idea of the World, a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality. Dr. Kastrup is really one of the foremost proponents of the idealistic metaphysical position. Once again, this interview is being conducted via the internet, so now I'll switch over to that channel. Welcome, Bernardo. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Great to be here, as usual, Jeff. I'm getting used to this.
You wrote the book Rationalist Spirituality with, I gather, with the idea in mind that there are a number of readers out there who are interested in spirituality but are put off by all of the crazy ideas and apparently irrational ideas often associated with not only religion but with esoteric traditions as well.
That's right. There is this cultural perception that there is a sort of dichotomy between spirituality and religion, or spirituality and rationality, that somehow anything that is spiritual is by definition not rational. And I don't agree with that. I think you can have a spiritual view of the world, a spiritual way to look upon life, upon yourself and the world, that does not defy rationality. It could very well be that to have a truly fulfilling spiritual outlook, you need to go beyond rationality. You may need to transcend it. You may need a certain degree of trust in intuition, in personal insight, things that you can't articulate in linear form according to the rules of logic. But you do not need to contradict rational thought in order to have a spiritual outlook.
Mm-hmm. Well, isn't that the basic premise behind the study of theology in general? I'm under the impression that theologians attempt to do exactly that, apply logic to spirituality.
I'm not necessarily endorsing all of that in the book. I come from a more personal perspective, and I try to put myself in the position of the reader, a regular, more or less educated person in 21st century culture, and I try to figure out and help the reader figure out with me whether there is room in the context of this culture for a spiritual outlook that doesn't contradict the basic axioms of rationality that dominate in the culture. When you go to theology, it's such a broad discipline You could have the interpretation of scriptures in theology. There is a history in theology that has a historical value, but I'm not sure there is much beyond that, like syllogisms that try to prove the existence of God. I think this kind of thing doesn't make much sense. But if by theology we understand a way to try to reconcile religious intuition, which I'm here calling spirituality because I'm trying to be sort of agnostic of any particular religion, but the underlying intuitions that base religion, if you're trying to reconcile that with a logical, rational framework, then I think theology is certainly a valid area of study.
Will you begin your exploration by asking the question, is there any meaning to existence?
I think that's the question that we all ultimately ask ourselves, right? I mean, I think it was Jung who said that a human being can bear almost anything, perhaps everything, so long as he can find meaning in it. We can bear a lot of suffering if we find meaning in our suffering, in what we are going through, and we live in a cultural context at this time, the early 21st century, where meaning has basically been extirpated out of our society, out of our culture, out of our joint view of the world, so to say. According to our mainstream views, the universe is a sort of a mechanical contraption driven by chance and some mechanical laws, blind laws, and we are born here for no reason, and eventually we die, and no trace of us will be left given enough time, no trace of anything we did, anything we thought, anything we felt. And then we ask ourselves, what is this crazy thing for, right? I mean, we are meaning-seeking animals. I think Paul Tillich said that already. Viktor Frankl said that as well, the will to meaning. So it is important for us, and I think that's a core aspect of the spiritual outlook, to discern meaning in life and the world. Not only the meaning we project arbitrarily on it, because that's just no meaning, it's something we make up, but some intrinsic meaning in our existence as biological creatures surviving in this world against the second law of thermodynamics. I think it's very important to discern that. And I think a spiritual outlook can provide a window into that landscape of meaning, so to say.
You actually come up with a good working definition of what the meaning of existence might be. I'm under the impression that the rational picture that you build upon is based on exactly that the universe does have meaning. In fact, more than meaning, the universe has purpose.
Yes, the word meaning is such a nice, flexible word, right? Because it can mean three things. It can mean a purpose, a goal. It can mean significance in the sense of the historical significance of a certain event. And it can also mean sense, denotation, connotation, what it points to. So the word meaning means these three things depending on context. And the way I use it in the book, I mean all three of them, because I think language has captured here something very important, which is the very tight relationship between meaning in the sense of sense, meaning in sense, denotation, connotation, meaning in the sense of goal, purpose, telos, and meaning in the sense of significance. I think these three things are intertwined. I think the meaning of life is the sense of life. It is also its significance, and both are its purpose. The purpose of life is to discern its sense, so to attain significance. So yeah, the book basically circles around this idea of meaning, and it tries to look for a rational framework according to which we can accommodate a perspective towards meaning without defying the basic axioms in our culture about what is considered valid in terms of a valid way of thinking, in terms of empirical basis, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, you point out that a lot of mainstream thinkers in philosophy and in science would say there is no meaning inherent in the universe at all. And you counter that argument by suggesting that science itself is incomplete. Science is not really qualified to make such an assertion.
Science is the study of the patterns and regularities of the behavior of nature, right? That's what the scientific method has been developed for, and that's all it can study. It cannot tell us about what nature essentially is, or even about what we essentially are. It only tells us, allows us to predict how nature might behave next time around, because nature's behavior is so regular that through experimentation and modeling you can predict it. I think there's a lot more to it, and I think the basis of discerning meaning in life in nature is the realization that consciousness is fundamental in the sense that we cannot reduce consciousness to something else. We cannot explain consciousness in terms of something else. Consciousness itself is the ground of reality, so to say. We should explain everything else in terms of consciousness. We should reduce everything else to consciousness. Technically, we say consciousness is then the ontological primitive, the sole member of my reduction base. That's the technical terms to explain this, to put this. If we make this move, and if we make this move coherently and rationally, without defying, observation and logic, this opens the door to meaning. Because where does meaning reside? Meaning is a conscious state. Meaning is a state of mind. It's something that we feel, right? If you do not reduce that to something else that is not conscious, to something else that has nothing to do with consciousness, like arrangements of matter and energy fundamentally outside consciousness, if you don't do that, then meaning truly exists. Meaning is a real thing. It's not an illusion, it's not an epiphenomenon, it's not a construct, it's not wish fulfillment, it's not self-deception. It is a real entity in the sense that it is a state of consciousness that really exists. And the basis of the book is to say, is to argue that consciousness is fundamental, and that the search for meaning is real because it's a state of consciousness, and that the search and achievement of meaning has to do with consciousness understanding itself. In other words, that the dance of existence may be a way for a universal mind to explore itself, to attain metacognitive knowledge of itself, instead of simply unfolding instinctively, like an entity that it is immersed in the turbulent currents of its own instinctual tendencies and dispositions, and cannot escape from that. And I think the dance of life, the existence of us, of human beings on planet Earth, is a way for consciousness to sort of stick its head out of the water, out of that turbulent flow, and look around and say, oh, okay, this is what's going on. I see now. I don't need to struggle blindly anymore. I have attained some metacognitive insight about the unfolding of my own will, of my own dispositions, my own struggle is now put in perspective, is now understood. I not only experience the struggle, I now experience the knowledge of the struggle, and I can contemplate this, I can ponder this, and I can extract conclusions about this, which may help universal consciousness finally achieve meaning by realizing its own potentials, so to say, to go on this trip, not blindly in the sense that it's purely instinctive, but awake in the sense that it can metacognize of what's going on, and then apprehends all the degrees of freedom of its own unfolding. It understands what it can feel, what it wants, what it doesn't, what it seeks, what it rejects, and why things unfold the way they do. I think therein lies the key to discerning true intrinsic meaning in life in the world, not just the existentialist projection that we make our own meaning and we project onto the world.
Well, this is fascinating. You're really getting into the core of your philosophy, the notion of the enrichment of consciousness for the benefit of some larger unbounded consciousness. But you make a crucial distinction. I think this is very important, between intelligence on the one hand and understanding or meaning on the other.
I think that is very, very important. I think I dedicate it's a very short book, but I dedicate the longest chapter to this distinction. You see, one of my backgrounds is computer science, computer engineering. I have worked with artificial intelligence for a while. I've struggled for years with the idea of how to create an intelligent machine. And I'm absolutely convinced it is possible. I mean, 20 odd years ago, we've made progress in this direction. Today, actually, we're not much further in terms of ideas, but the hardware is so much faster that old ideas that didn't work then now work. like deep learning, things that we tried back then, but we just didn't have the hardware to make it work. But what is intelligence? Intelligence, what we call an intelligent machine, is a machine that can process information in a way that is analogous to how we seem to process information. So information comes in, it's processed, something is spit out on the other end, and if you compare what goes in and what goes out, a machine can process this data in a way analogous to what a human being would do for certain limited classes of problems. For instance, playing chess, or processing words, or translation. I mean, Google Translate is spectacularly good today. We could see the progress of that thing over the past few years. But intelligence does not entail or imply insight, knowledge, understanding. Because all that data processing that happens in a computer, at least in principle, does not need to be accompanied by conscious states. In other words, a computer might as well operate blindly. It's not aware of what it's doing. There is nothing it is like to be the computer while it is processing data. But there is certainly something it is like to be me when I am processing data. When I am processing data, I not only spit out an output, I attain insight. I attain understanding, that insight of understanding while I am doing that data processing. And that's the key difference, because it tells us that while artificial intelligence may be entirely possible, it certainly is, we know by now, artificial consciousness may be a completely different story. And in the book I give this example of the Chinese room experiment. I don't know whether you want to go into that at this point. But just to wrap it up here, I think the search for meaning and the realization of meaning has to do with insight, with conscious understanding, not merely with computation. Computation achieves no meaning. There is no understanding there. There is just data crunching.
I suppose one of the biggest problems today in science is how consciousness interacts with the physical brain. It seems to be a complete mystery, and you use a wonderful metaphor to try and get at that problem by talking about of all things, the Mars Rover.
Yes. Well, I have to make a disclaimer. I am an idealist in the sense that I believe that all there truly is at the bottom of the reduction chain, at the foundation level of nature, all that truly is consciousness. Matter is just a phenomenon of consciousness in consciousness. It's just the appearance of certain conscious processes when observed from a dissociated perspective. That's what matter is. It's just what certain conscious processes look like from a certain perspective. I'm not a dualist. I don't think there is this one thing called matter and this other thing fundamentally different called consciousness, and that they somehow interact. I don't think that. However, I do think dualism is a useful metaphor. And I use it in the book as a metaphor. So before I adopt the metaphor and never go back to idealism, let me just make that bridge right now. To me, what happens is that there is only one universal consciousness. Every living organism is a dissociated alter, a dissociated personality of this universal consciousness, in a way analogous to how somebody with a multiple personality disorder has multiple disjoint centers of consciousness that are also called alters. So I think you and I are disjoint, dissociated centers of consciousness, of universal consciousness, and so is every living creature. Now, within us, there can be dissociation as well. I mean, a person can be dissociated. We know that from psychiatry. And the parts of us that we have direct introspective access to, I can access my feelings, I can access my thoughts introspectively. In other words, I know what I'm feeling, I know what I'm thinking, I know what I'm seeing. I have this metacognitive access to certain inner experiences of myself. That is what we could call now my consciousness. But it's not only qualia, it's not only what it is likeness, it requires this extra thing called meta-consciousness, or conscious meta-cognition, because that's what we can access introspectively. Now, the rest of me that I cannot access, for instance, I cannot introspect into my liver function. I don't know what's going on in my liver. I don't feel what it is like to be my liver in the way I feel what it is like to be my nervous system. What is it like to be my nervous system? It's what it is like to be me. That's what I can introspectively access. But I don't know what it is like to be my liver. I don't know what it is like to be my kidneys. I cannot introspect into the experiences that correspond to that. So there is an internal dissociation in myself as a human being. So my point is the following. I will bridge to dualism in the following way. I will say that mind is those inner conscious states of my being that I can introspectively access. And matter is everything else. In other words, my mind inhabits my body in the sense that my nervous system inhabits everything else. My muscles, my fat cells, my skeleton, my nervous system is embedded in it and interacts with it. I don't think there is anything more to my muscles and my skeleton and my fat cells than conscious states. I think they're just the extrinsic appearance of conscious states. But I cannot introspectively access those conscious states. So it all works as if they were actually separate from me. So I will call that the matter of my body. And I will call the conscious states that I can introspectively access, that I can metacognize, I will call that my mind. And because my body is made of the same atoms and force fields as the rest of the world of matter out there, the inanimate world, everything else, then we could say body and the rest of the inanimate world, they are all matter. And the conscious states that corresponds to my nervous system, which I can introspectively access, that is mind. So mind inhabits the material world from that perspective. Mm-hmm. So
and I think you also point out that we don't have direct access to anything in the material world.
Correct. In the same way that we don't have introspective access to what it is like to be our liver. Mm. I mean, if I'm punched in the liver, I will feel it, but I will feel it because there are branches of my nervous system that go into my liver and pick up information about what's going on there. But that is still what it is like to be my nervous system, not what it is like to be my liver. I only know what it is like to be my nervous system. And the same applies for the rest of the world. I don't know what it is like to be this computer. I don't know what it is like to be Jeff. I don't know what it is like to be the moon. But I do think that underlying Jeff, underlying the moon, or actually underlying the inanimate universe as a whole, there are conscious states that I am dissociated from, and therefore I cannot introspectively access. And the inanimate universe is just what those conscious states, mind at large, if you will, look like from my perspective, from across a dissociative boundary. Okay, so that's how I map dualism as a metaphor within idealism. And I think idealism is ultimately true. Dualism is only penultimately true. It's only a metaphor within idealism. But from now on, let's take that metaphor of dualism and let's talk only about the dualism.
Okay, well, I introduced the metaphor of the Mars Rover, which I think is very elegant. And I know we could go in many directions from here, but you think our viewers will benefit from understanding that, how you use that metaphor.
Yes. Well, I wrote this book years ago, and at the time it was still more or less recent on all the Mars Rover stories, opportunity, everything that happened back then. I think what is interesting about the analogy is the following. Look at what happened. We wanted to gain insight, to gain knowledge, to gain understanding about a place we couldn't go to, Mars. So we send these robotic explorers, and they become our channel to understand Mars. We experienced Mars through the rovers. Everything we could see of Mars were images acquired by the rovers. Everything we could test or experiment with in Mars was information gathered by the instruments within the rover. Every action we carried out on Mars, like leaving tracks on the soil or drilling into certain rocks, actions we carried out on that planet, were carried out through the rovers. So the rovers were our interface, not only for gathering knowledge, but for interacting with a place that we couldn't otherwise learn about, gain insight into. I think the body, the material body, is like a Mars rover, but in the realm of the material universe. I think for consciousness to gain insight about itself, it needs to have this subject-object relationship. I mean, this is something that we know since Kant and Schopenhauer, this idea that metacognitive understanding, which Schopenhauer called representation of representation, or abstract representations is what he called it. This idea that you have to be a subject separate from a object in order to have this understanding of that object. If you collapse the two into one, metacognition becomes impossible. And the rover analogy allows for, suppose our bodies are the rovers, it encapsulates the subject, consciousness, in a way that the rest of the world becomes objectified. And metacognitive understanding of the rest of the world as an image of the rest of consciousness, as a representation, as a symbol of broader conscious activity becomes possible. So we are like Mars rovers. Our bodies are like Mars rovers for universal consciousness to study and understand itself in an objectified manner. We are here to explore ourselves through the vehicle of the body, so to say.
So in effect, consciousness in this analogy would be equivalent to the people at Caltech in Pasadena, California, who are operating the Mars Rover.
Yes, that would be the analogy. What we truly are would be the operators of the Mars Rover, so to say. And without the Mars Rover, we couldn't gather the kind of insight that we can through the Mars rover, through the body, because there wouldn't be this objectification, this split between subject and object, which allows for this metacognitive insight, this aha of, oh, now I see what's going on, which requires that you become somehow separated from the object of your insight. Because if you're completely conflated, there is no such aha of understanding. Because what is it that you understand? The understander and the understood are one and the same thing. And metacognition becomes impossible, because metacognition, the basis of metacognition, is precisely this split between the experience and the experiencer. So the experience can be reflected on the experience that then ponders about it, like, oh, I am having that experience. But if you are the experience, there is no metacognitive insight. So the vehicle of the body is this vehicle of objectification that allows for the attainment of this metacognitive aha, of this understanding of, oh, this is what's going on.
Well, all of this leads to a kind of paradox, which is that the consciousness, from the idealistic perspective, if the whole material universe is born out of consciousness somehow, you're talking about a very different consciousness than our individual consciousness, something you describe as completely unbounded. And then the paradox is, if consciousness is completely unbounded, how is it that we seem to be limited in our understanding to what this Mars Rover analogy of a body can provide us?
I say consciousness is unbound because bounds only make sense in the context of space-time extension, right? You need to extend existence into space and time in order to talk about bounds. If consciousness is in principle at a fundamental level outside space-time, if space-time are just qualities of experience, experiential states of consciousness, then you cannot talk about a bound in consciousness. The physical universe is in consciousness, not consciousness in the physical universe. So it makes no sense to try to put a bound for consciousness in the context of the physical universe. I mean, it is the universe that is in consciousness, not the way around. Yet, we are clearly limited because, we identify with the Mars Rover. We put on the suit and we tell ourselves the story that we are the suit. Because as a consequence of this necessary objectification of the world, the scope of our individual awareness becomes reduced. And it must, otherwise you are everything. And if you're everything, how can you attain metacognition? Now there is no object for you to attain insight of. You are that too.
Let's see if we can make a distinction between what you are calling metacognition and what you also refer to in your book, the work of R.M. Buck, his notion of cosmic consciousness.
Richard Maurice Buck, I think, is the psychiatrist from the end of the 19th century, turn to the 20th century. He wrote this fascinating book called Cosmic Consciousness. He was a psychiatrist, and he had these case studies about people who temporarily, under certain special circumstances, attained what he then labeled cosmic consciousness, which is this understanding or this felt recognition that their true identity is not bound by individual limitations given by the body. That in fact what they really are is everything. That there are no bounds to their sense of I-ness, to their, and the technical word would be ipseity. And I think where this comes from is the following. There are two aspects to consciousness very fundamentally. One is the contents of consciousness. The contents of consciousness vary. Particular experiences come and go. I'm looking at the screen now. Later on I will be looking at the sky. And it's a beautiful evening here in the Netherlands today. So the contents of consciousness vary. One day I'm feeling one way, the next day I'm feeling another way. And then there is the dative of experience. The dative of experience is that to which experience is given, that to which experience is disclosed. In other words, the experiencer, the subject of experience. That is, it never varies. There is there is always one and the same subject of experience. If you eliminate all the contents of your consciousness, all of your memories, everything you know, everything you think, all of your opinions, you eliminate all that. And then check how you feel. And then if I do the same, I will feel exactly like you feel. Because we will both be the pure dative of experience, contentless experiencer. It's just a way to say that there is a subject, even if there are no contents of experience. Even if the subject is experiencing nothing, there is still the dative of experience. That to which experience will be given once it happens. And there is still something it is like to be the pure dative of experience. That would be the experience of pure subjectivity, of pure being. Now, before you experience anything, you experience I am. That is the dative of experience. This center of awareness around which the world unfolds as a series of experiences. And the claim is that that center is the same in you, is the same in me. It's identical. It's not differentiated because only certain contents allow it to differentiate by identifying with those contents. I think what Richard Maurice Buck realized is that some people attain the ability to identify directly with the dative, the pure dative, and not with particular contents. In other words, not with the story of Jeff, not with the story of Bernardo, not with the memories of Jeff, not with the memories of Bernardo, not with the opinions of Jeff or the opinions of Bernardo. And the moment you disconnect from this false identification with contents and you identify with the pure dative, then suddenly you are everything. And I think that's the original state of our consciousness, because we are the universal consciousness, prior to dressing this suit, prior to, getting to operate the Mars Rover. That's the root of us right now.
And you describe that as a direct experience rather than as an indirect inference.
I think it works both ways, but of course the direct experience is the only one that really is juicy. It's the only one that is really transformative. It's the only one that you would truly believe. The other one you may accept on rational and conceptual grounds. You may even say, well, it is true. But you don't feel it is true. It's a conceptual conclusion. It's not a direct experience. I think only the direct experience is truly transformative. And I think it is accessible to all of us.
I know Buck in his book on cosmic consciousness talks about people who have, in this experience, it's not vision through the eyes, but they describe it as 360-degree vision. They can see in every direction, infinitely far. They're just like at one with everything. It's obviously an ineffable experience, but that's often how it's described.
Yeah, I think people... I think it's delicate. Let me tell you what I think about it, since you triggered me now. If these were entirely possible, that as the universal dative of experience, without the meat suit, without the Mars Rover, without the body, that we could in fact literally see everything and hear everything and understand everything, then I would argue we don't need the meat suit. We don't need the Mars Rover. This whole thing is a cruel play. Why is this happening? I think what happens is that when they are in that state of cosmic consciousness, they cognize something that is completely ineffable. They do not metacognize that when they are in that state, but they carry vestiges of it back to the state they have when they are in the body. And it's only when they are in the body that they look back at those vestiges, those memories that are ineffable, and they coat it with a conceptual framework. They give words to it. Those words are necessarily metaphors. Even if they claim otherwise, I think they are necessarily metaphors. I saw everything. No, you haven't seen anything. You didn't have eyes. Eyes are a thing of the Mars Rover. It's the little cameras on the Mars Rover. Know what I mean? You became directly acquainted with something that you call seeing once you're back. Because that's the only word you have. that's the only thing language allows you to say, because you don't have words for direct acquaintance. Language didn't evolve to capture that idea, to capture that experience. Language evolved here, on Mars, with the Mars rovers going around. And I think most people do not have the subtlety to make this differentiation when they are communicating their experience. And they are not to be blamed. They only have the language they have, and they're struggling to say whatever they can say about something that is fundamentally, almost by definition, ineffable. So I think what happened is that they become acquainted with everything. It's not seeing. It's a different form of cognition. It's not metacognition either. There is no separation between subject and object. You cannot attain that insights of that, this is what's going on, because that requires objectification. They just become directly acquainted, and they carry a memory of that, a vestige of that in the form of a memory, which they then process once they are back in this state of consciousness. They attach concepts to that, they process those concepts, and then they spit out a statement or a description that we should take with a grain of salt, because that's by definition a metaphor already.
Well, another, I think, brilliant argument that you raise, which is crucial to the point you're trying to make here about the meaning of the universe and the purpose of existence, you draw upon the information theory of Claude Shannon to point out why existence as we know it is really necessary.
Shannon's idea is that information is a measure of the discernible states of a system. For instance, if you call me and you ask, how am I doing? And I tell you I'm doing well, that there is very little information there, because well means that I'm not doing not okay. So I'm only differentiating one state from another. It's only binary. There is one bit of information. Either I'm well or I'm not, and I just told you I'm well. But if you ask me, where have you been yesterday? And I give you an answer, I've been to that Italian restaurant, then that has a lot more information, because I could have been in so many other places. You know what I mean? That's information. But notice that there are two parties involved in this exchange. The person who calls me and myself. We are having a telephone call, so to say. And that's fundamental to the idea of information, that you need to have this split between two parties, a transmitter and a receiver, a sender and a receiver, so to say. This is what allows you to objectify something and gather information about it. You need to have a sender, you being the receiver, in order to learn information about that. And I think that's what the meat suit does. That's what the Mars rover does. It creates this split, this object-subject split, which allows for the rise of information. And insight arises from the conscious processing of that information. The intelligent processing of that information when accompanied by conscious states. That's where insight arises from. So from that perspective, being incarnated is a vehicle for the rise of information and insight.
Mm-hmm. And you point out that unbounded consciousness is devoid of information based on Shannon's definition.
There is no sender and receiver. There is only one thing going on. I mean, if you don't have this ability to separate and objectify what you're trying to understand, then you don't have pain. You are the pain. You don't have perceptions, you are the perception. You don't have feelings, you are the feeling. How can you then understand why you have pain, why you have feelings, or what you are seeing? If you are the pain, if you are the feeling, if you are what you are seeing, you cannot metacognize that. It is fundamentally impossible. You need the object-subject split. Schopenhauer already talked about that. I mean, that guy saw everything hundreds of years before the rest of us. He already talked about that. He already said that the world as representation is in service of the will. The will is this universal consciousness. And our ability to represent the will through perception, our ability to separate ourselves from the will and contemplate it through the eyes of the body, the ears of the body, objectifying it and then gathering information about it, is a vehicle for knowledge and insight. I think he was spot on.
Now, you use a different term, which I think might be analogous to Schopenhauer's notion of the will. You talk about the principle of insight, and I think that's the phrase you use. And go ahead.
No, that's not equivalent to the will. I think the will is equivalent to universal consciousness.
Principle of insight is even deeper than that, I gather.
I think it has to do with the evolutionary process. If we want to interpret nature as being in an evolutionary process, and I think it is, the idea here is that, okay, what is then the meaning of our existence in this form, in the form of incarnated minds, dressed in this meat suit? I think the meaning of this is that through this we gather information about the other aspects of universal consciousness that we become dissociated from the moment we incarnate, so to say, and then accumulating insight about it through this subject-object perspective. And it is the accumulation of insights that realizes the intrinsic potential of universal consciousness. The intrinsic potential of universal consciousness is not only to express everything it can express, but to metacognize all the forms of its expression, all the possible forms of its expression. In other words, to feel everything it can feel, and to know that it feels it. To perceive everything it can perceive, and to know that it is perceiving it. These are the potentials of consciousness, the inherent potentials of consciousness, everything it can experience, everything it can feel, everything it can perceive, everything it can think. And through us, these potentials are realized and metacognized. And they are metacognized through the insight of understanding. So I think the meaning of our lives here is to accumulate these insights of understanding. Every insight of understanding we have about the world contributes to the universal telos, to the universal goal of consciousness. It adds one more element, one more step in its journey towards self-awareness, towards metacognizing all of its potentials. And by this, I mean absolutely any insight. I don't mean by this only the pleasant insights, those insights that you go, whoa, that is cool, or oh, now I grasp it. But also the insight of, my God, how much we can suffer, how excruciating suffering can be, or how evil people can be. This is also an important insight of understanding. Here we have universal consciousness looking at itself through the objectification that is allowed by incarnation. One piece of universal consciousness, me, looking at another piece of universal consciousness, say, a criminal, and realizing that is also a potential of universal consciousness. That is also something universal consciousness can express. It is intrinsic to it that it can express itself in that way too. And that's not a pleasant insight. It's certainly a sobering insight. But I think we must recognize this. I mean, evil and suffering, these are parts of nature. I mean, they are abundant. To pretend that they are not part of the potentials of universal consciousness is at least naive. And I think it is part of this universal journey to gather an insight about that too, to recognize that too in Jungian terminology, to acknowledge the collective shadow, to acknowledge that this is also part of what we fundamentally are. Not me as a person, but certainly me as the universal dative of experience is capable of that. And to develop a metacognitive understanding of that in a morally neutral manner, I think is important.
Now you have enunciated the meaning and the purpose of existence itself. I think that's brilliant, Bernardo. But you even go further because you suggest that if your argument is correct, that necessarily implies something akin to what the mystics have called the akashic records.
I think, well, there is a better argument in the book, but I'll flip the argument around because it's easier. If all these insights that we accumulate as incarnated minds, incarnated consciousnesses, or dissociated alters of universal consciousness, if these were all lost when we left the Mars Rover, when we left the body upon death, then all this struggle would be for nothing. All the progress we make would be lost upon death. I think what truly happens is that this idea of loss, it's a space-time bound idea, which is dependent on incarnation. It's dependent on assuming this bodily form or inhabiting this body, like the nervous system inhabits this colony of cells that sort of encapsulates it. Only there does the idea of space-time make sense. And only within space-time does the idea of loss make sense. I think at a more fundamental level of nature, behind or underneath space-time, there is no loss. There is only a constant parallel experiencing. In other words, at the level of universal consciousness, prior to incarnation, every possible experience is experienced concurrently now. It was not experienced before, it's not going to be experienced in the future because there is no time. There is only experience now, and these experiences just pile up. From the perspective of space-time, it's very difficult to talk about something outside space-time because we evolved to think and speak in terms of space-time. So from the perspective of space-time, we could use a metaphor and say, well, there is a universal record of experience. Everything that any individual living creature has ever experienced is then stored forever in this universal record, which historically has been given the name the Akasha. And I think that's just a space-time metaphor for what actually happens, which is this constant, parallel, simultaneous experiencing of everything that can be experienced. So everything you've ever gone through in your life, in your past, it's not lost. It's only lost from the incarnated perspective of space-time because you can't access it right now. But there is a state of mind in which you, as the universal dative, can experience your life, all of it, every single aspect of it, every little detail of it, simultaneously, in one go, at a glance. And that is equivalent, from our little perspective here, as a sort of universal memory. Because the information is never lost. Where is it going to go? There is no time. It doesn't go anywhere, right?
You don't address this in this particular book. In fact, I haven't read in any of your books thus far that you address this, but I'm curious. So I have to ask you, what about the future? Are you saying that the future already exists in universal consciousness?
I just, what a synchronicity. I am... breaking news now, okay? I was not planning to say this until after the fact, but I can't resist it now. I just had a second PhD thesis approved. I'm going to be defending a second PhD shortly, in April. The thesis is approved. It's a done deal. It's just a ceremony to defend it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Actually, the thesis is about the core ideas of my work. Which I figured, no, I've published so many papers already. Why not just put them together and submit a thesis? And I did it, and the university has accepted it. Mm-hmm. I was having this discussion with one of the members of the committee. And he asked me precisely that, because he was trying to pin me down on my ontological position regarding time. You know, there are two main ontologies of time. One is called presentism, which is the idea that only present things exist. And now past things and future things don't exist. They are just expectations and memories. They don't really exist. And there is this alternative ontology, popularly called the block universe idea, but formally called eternalism, which is the idea is that all time is equally real. past things are equally real as present things. And future things are also just as real as present things. That past, present, and future exist as a block, and we are just traversing that block. But the block itself, that loaf of bread that we partition to tell what the present is, the entire loaf of bread exists at once. And this seems to be an implication of the theory of relativity. The jury is still out, but it seems to be an implication of the theory of relativity. And then this member of the committee started telling me that, it looks like you're oscillating between the two. Sometimes you argue like you're a presentist. You say, there is only the now, the eternal now. There is no future, there is no past. And sometimes you argue as if you were an eternalist, because you say that the past is equivalent to the present and is equivalent to the future. So let me be very specific, as I have been now by making the last correction to the thesis to satisfy this comment. I think ontologically, in terms of what really exists, there is only the now. And I don't want to use the word present, because if I use that word, it seems that I am already acknowledging past and future. I don't. I think there is only ever the now. Everything happens in the now. You never experience anything outside the now. If you experience your memories, you're projecting that they correspond to the past, but the experience of memories happens now. You can think about the future, you can make predictions, you may have expectations, but you experience those expectations now. The images, your imagination about the future is experienced now, and so is the experience of your memories. And then you say, you're a presentist. No. Because I also think the past is just as real as the present, insofar as the experience of memories also happens now, just as my experience of this screen in front of me happens now. My memories are an experiential state in the now, just as my current perceptions are experiential states in the now. Just as my expectations and fears and anxieties about the future and hopes about the future are experiential states in the now. So I think I think what we label, the experiences we label as past, present, and future are all equally real. They are all experiential states experienced in the now. But ontologically, past and future are just theoretical abstractions. They help us talk about these now experiences. They help us categorize our experiential states into memories, expectations, and perceptions, or current thoughts, whatever. It's just a handy tool. I don't think there ontologically is anything that is outside the now, either in the past or in the future.
In other words, to simplify things, you don't subscribe to the block universe.
That's what I was trying to avoid. I didn't want to be labeled that way. So I went to... I failed in what I was trying to do, Jeff. I explained all that precisely. Okay, the point I want to make is the following. This partitioning of the conceptual space between presentism and eternalism is not suitable for my position. There are many ways you can partition this conceptual space. One of them is eternalism and presentism, but I don't subscribe to this partitioning because, you understand what I mean?
I think someday we could have a lengthier discussion just about time. Another alternative is the conventional view that time is moving forward in one direction only.
That's an alternative, yeah. But even that could be framed as presentist or eternalist as well. I think with the block universe, with eternalism, I have the following position. There is an ontological equivalence between past, present, and future. Okay, let me be more specific. What we call the past, the future, and the present are just experiential states that are experienced now. From that perspective, they are all equivalent. So what we label as past, present, and future, in my mind, are equivalent and all equally real. With that, I go with eternalism. But I don't think there is this separate entity outside the now that we call the past, or this separate entity outside the now that we call the future. I don't think they are there. I think what we call past and future are just certain types of experiential states in the now.
When I use the phrase "the block universe" in my mind, I'm picturing like a big block, like an ice cube, and we're moving along like a line across this block, and so we move from past into the future, which as a parapsychologist, I'm interested in precognition and the fact that occasionally people come up with vivid, accurate descriptions in great detail of future events for which there is no normal explanation. It implies, to a naive mind like my own, that the future has already happened.
I think we are fundamentally limited by our current conceptual frameworks. We partition reality according to certain conceptual structures that we then project onto reality, and we tile it with those conceptual structures, and then we mistake reality for that tiling. We mistake reality for the names and the divisions and the partitionings we do with it. And sometimes we even lose sight of the fact that there is a lot more space there than what we covered with our little concepts. There are lots of unexplored holes in reality that are not covered by our conceptual web. And I think time is one of these glaring holes. I think our limited conceptualization of what time is leads to all kinds of artifacts. I think it is possible to, and I say that because of empirical reasons, personal experiences or experiences of people very close to me that I have witnessed. I think it's empirically a fact that the future can be seen and can be anticipated, sometimes with astonishing degrees of accuracy. I think it's an empirical fact that we can acquire knowledge across space that transcends the possibilities of the senses. But I think the language we quote this realization with is contaminated by a limited conceptualization of space and time. We have a limited and limiting as well understanding of space and time, and we conceptualize it in a limited way. Even the idea of survival, the survival of the personality, in other words, survival not only of the dative, because that of course survives, it's the only thing that exists, where is it going to go? But also of the story of the personal self, the survival of that story of the personal self that people conceptualize in terms of a soul that leaves the body. I mean, I'm guilty of this kind of metaphor in this book. But even this idea is an artifact of a bad conceptualization of time. An alternative way to think of it would be to say, time exists only while we are incarnated. From the perspective of the incarnation, we can talk about reincarnation and precognition and past life memories and all that. But in reality, what is the reality? The reality is what is there when you're not incarnated, when you're not dressed in a meat suit, when you're not limited by the sensors and actuators of the Mars Rover. Because that's not your reality. The people at JPL, at the end of the day, they take their coats and they go home, and that's their reality. Not the little images that come to their screens from Mars. So I think the reality that is there once we put our coats and go home and leave the Mars Rover behind, time from that perspective is a very, very different thing than we conceptualize here. And from that perspective, the language would be very different. We would not talk about a soul leaving the body and coming back. From that perspective, you never cease to be Jeff. The story of Jeff is one of the concurrent experiences in the Akasha that never goes away. It has never started. It will never end. It's always there. Jeff is always there. Not because Jeff's soul left his body and eventually we will reincarnate again. No, because Jeff can never cease to be, because it's a set of experiences that are being concurrently experienced by universal consciousness outside a space-time framework. I think that's a much more productive way of talking about survival, that the story of Jeff fundamentally exists outside space-time, than the idea of a more or less objective soul, a kind of gaseous thing that floats out of the body and goes some other place and can be communicated with. I think it's more productive to think in terms of an expansion of consciousness and an attainment of cosmic consciousness, through which we become acquainted with the concurrent experiences in the akashic record that are outside time. And therefore, there is no future, there is no past, there is no point in talking about these things.
And of course, I get what you're saying, but there is no Jeff really either.
Correct. Jeff is a story.
Yeah.
But the story is experienced. Mm-hmm. So whatever Jeff is, even if it is a story,
the story will continue, but the name Jeff is going to drop away.
Well, we shouldn't even say it will continue, because it will continue means that it will have extension in time. But what we are saying here is that there is no time. The story of Jeff is.
I get it. Yeah. Let me shift once again, Bernardo, to the principle of insight that we talked about a little earlier. Martin Luther King once said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think what you're saying is something similar. The arc of history, and here we are back in time again, bends toward insight.
I think it's an inevitable thing. I think the realization of the meaning of life is inevitable. Because even if your life is crap and everything is going wrong, you are experiencing that. There is a realization, this is happening to me. I am profoundly unhappy. This shit can happen. You know, nature allows for this. Even if your whole life is full of suffering, that's an insight. Nature allows for this. There's something in nature that allows for this to happen. And people inevitably think about what they are going through. Actually, nothing is more effective than suffering to trigger metacognition. When everything's going okay and you're happy and everything's turning out well, you don't stop to think about it. You just go with the flow. You become sort of you become like my cat, you know. You're just experiencing, and you're all happy, and you're surfing, you're riding the wave of life, but you're not examining it, you know, that old metaphor, the unexamined life. Nothing's better than suffering to force you to, stop, look, what the hell is going on here? How did it come to this? How is this possible? What's going on? What do I make of this? So I think this arch back to insight is not even an arch back, it's a continuum. We never leave the space of insight. Whatever happens in your life, you never leave that space. Whatever happens in your life, you're always contributing to the achievement of the final goal of this whole dance. Maybe in very unpleasant ways, but those are particularly meaningful.
I think we've covered most of the important points in this wonderful book of yours, Bernardo. I know the conversation is fascinating, and we could go on for a long time, but I do think we've kind of touched on everything, and I want to encourage our viewers to take a look at the book if they have further interest, because obviously in a conversation like this we can never be as precise as you are in the written form, which people who are really interested in the logic will want to know those details. But thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Thanks so much.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy, go to newthinkingaloud.org.